right, so let's talk about number 4. So, of the two theoretical perspectives that you pick to explain and compare and how they would help us to understand the cause of the social problem that you've chosen. So, in my example, I am using the behavioral perspective and the humanistic perspective to think about depression. And so, for the behavioral perspective, the cause of depression would be that there are faulty beliefs or that there are behaviors that are pleasurable that a person is not doing because they're depressed and not engaged, and that we need to replace these negative behaviors that don't promote well-being with more alternative, healthier behaviors. And the cause of depression in the behavioral perspective is behavior. And because it's the cause, it's also considered the treatment. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. Then the humanistic perspective really looks at validation in relationships and how that can lead to a person internalizing, um, a sense of low self esteem or self concept, self worth, and that drives depression, and that a solution for addressing that cause may be found in repairing a person's interpersonal relationships. So let's look at what this looks like in an intervention, because our next step is going to pick one of these interventions based on how practical we think it is for your case. Would a social worker be the person who implements this intervention? Because for the requirements of this assignment, we want it to be a social work intervention. So that just means that a social worker could administer that intervention. So behavioral activation is a treatment that is rooted in the behavioral perspective for depression. And the idea is that people who are depressed are isolated and not engaged. And so, even though the idea is similar to the idea of the interpersonal and the humanistic perspective of needing social support, behavioral activation only focuses on the behavior. So we are only concerned with people going out and doing it. So when you use behavioral activation, you might have a client record, how often they do pleasurable activities, because the idea is going to be to replace behaviors that, um, you know, keep the depression persistent with alternative, healthier behaviors that break that cycle. And so, even though a person may be tracking how many times they call a friend, perhaps, it's still different from the humanistic perspective, because behavioral activation, that's where that ends. And that's all that we're concerned about is, did the person do this? Are they engaging in more behaviors? And from the behavioral perspective, that should be enough that you're just engaging in this behavior. There is less exploration about what aspects of social support or relationships that help a person come out of depression. Whereas a therapy that's rooted in more of a humanistic perspective is called interpersonal therapy or IPT. And this is a very structured intervention. It's usually a short term intervention, and a lot of the research has been done on anxiety and depression among young adults and adolescents, but it has been studied across multiple disorders and age groups. And the idea here is not like in a psychodynamic perspective where we would look at past relationships, but focusing on your relationships now and how we can harness, um, positive interactions and positive relationships that you have now to help a person lift out of depression. You'll find some resources about each one of these types of interventions in the resources section on the Moodle site and in the Reflection Project section. So you can learn a little bit more about these interventions to better your understanding of the example.